Yes.
Hello, Sarah. Today, let's dive into self-compassion because last time we chatted, and what an awesome chat, but we looked at the inner critic and we talked about, or you taught me, how the inner critic is part of our brain that we all have.
Mhm.
It's part of the way we learn to survive. So it's primitive to our brain. Our brain is wired with this inner critic to keep us safe. It had a purpose.
Mhm.
But then through the chat, we were looking at, or you were teaching me particularly, and how to gain strategies to turn the volume down on the inner critic or to work with the inner critic in another way. And one of the things we mentioned was self compassion, which I think is a bit of a buzzword. Like, I feel like we hear this word self compassion. It's all good to say, have self compassion or give someone else self compassion. Like, we can be nice at other people, but it's really tough to give myself self compassion. And
Yeah.
I find when I work with a lot of women, we all find this really hard. So I guess, can we find out what self compassion is and
Mhm.
why it's important to learn? Like, why do we need to give some management tools to this inner critic? And then what does this self compassion thing look like?
Excellent. So, so many. Self-compassion, I think like you said, it's really hard. It is really hard. And it is that buzzword. And when we words like that kind of go into pop culture, what we find is we lose track of what it actually looks like. Um, and how we would implement it. And I think, like the self-care, it just becomes an extra thing to do in our day. And most of us don't have that space
Yeah,
to
let's go get
add.
a facial and that's another task.
I know, I'm like, I don't have time to do that. Who's going to look after my kids? When am I going
But
to
I
fit
think
everything
that
else in?
self-care, it became a task and forgot the root, like
Yes.
why we thought that was a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we look at self-compassion,
Mm.
it's hard because we're not born knowing how to do it.
Ah,
It's a skill. If you think about when a baby is born, it knows its needs and it tries to communicate whether it needs feeding or sleeping or changing, but it doesn't know how to be kind to itself to meet those needs. It needs other people to be compassionate to that baby, to care for it and nurture it and help it grow. Self-compassion is how we nurture ourselves. And I think there's a really good definition I like from the Centre of Clinical Excellence in WA, and it describes compassion as, I'm going to read it so I get it right, an attitude that involves a certain set of feelings, thoughts, motives, desires, urges, and behaviors that can be directed towards any living thing. So self compassion is the attitude we have towards ourselves.
but we're not born with it, which makes so much sense because
Yeah.
I remember when the boys were little, they'd take a toy and you'd have to say, no, don't do that. Like the natural thing is just to protect, take what you need,
Yep.
look after yourself, isn't
Yep.
it?
Yep.
But
Because I think,
yeah.
yeah, like we talked about the inner critic, it's that threat system. Like being
Mm,
nice to ourselves doesn't help us if there's a tiger coming to get us. Like if
yeah.
we sit down and we try to make ourselves feel better while this animal is trying to maul us, we're not going to survive. So that threat system is really important. But if we stay in it too long, there are all these negative impacts we now know on physical health, on mental health, emotional well-being, and that's because we're not designed to be in a threat state for so long.
Mm.
Um, and the self-compassion is a really great skill that I wish more of us were taught, that helps us get out of that threat system for I guess those, I want to say minor day-to-day things, like when you forget an appointment, you go
Mm.
into threat system, but self-compassion is a thing that brings you out of it quicker. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, because our modern lifestyle, like you said, I, my understanding is that threat system was only designed for small doses, like that level of adrenaline for small
Yeah.
doses, wasn't it? But
Yeah.
our body can't decipher between different threat systems. So it doesn't know if that threat is because of the endless email list or the to-do job list that we have as mums and women, or if it's because a tiger's chasing us. Like
Yes.
it doesn't know, it just knows there's high levels of cortisol. It
Yeah.
just knows that there's a threat. And I guess what's the impact on our health if we are living in this threat system? Like,
Oh, so much. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I feel like I say that a lot. I don't, so I don't have all the details on the medical stuff, but we know that it increases blood pressure. We know that it increases even mobility issues with, back pain, neck pain, IBS, like migraines, headaches, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, like the list goes on and on and on. And when we look at the emotional mental health side of it, I think we were talking recently about the impact of the last 3 years of COVID. Like
mm,
we are seeing trauma responses, PTSD responses in people purely because of extended periods of being in that threat space.
mm,
And that takes its toll as higher rates of depression, anxiety. It impacts relationships and jobs and like everything. It just impacts everything.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
So it's important not to stay in that threat system. Like
yeah,
that threat system long was only designed for small, and if we're in it long term, there's bigger things than you and I medically can even
yeah,
describe, but we
yeah,
see it in practice more and more in conditions that people are experiencing. You
yeah,
particularly as a psychologist see stacks of this.
yeah,
um, and I guess that's where in what we're doing here is recognizing that self-compassion isn't a buzzword. Self-compassion is actually what we need to invest in if we're going to be able to cope and prevent that burnout. Like you said, all those medical things that come with burnout
yeah,
because we live in the threat systems
yeah,
of flight, fight.
yeah,
If we live there, there's burnout. And if we
yeah,
want to prevent burnout, we actually need to invest in this buzzword. It's called self-compassion, which
yeah.
we're not born with, you said. Like we actually, so that
No.
makes me feel like half normal, that I find it really hard.
And I think especially in the society we at least you and I have grown up in, and I think most in the world are the same, kind of. Those self-compassion behaviors um might be interpreted as self-indulgent or lazy or selfish, which are the things we are taught are really negative and bad and we shouldn't do them. But being able to recognize what is going on with ourselves mentally, physically, in our life, validate our experience and soothe our central nervous system,
Wow.
that's vital to being able to live that engaged, balanced, enjoyable life.
Wow. So recognize and validate to be able to
Yeah.
learn to self-soothe. That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we talked about like, what does that look like? Because
Mm,
again, buzzword. And I think you and I are really big on being realistic about these things, right?
mm.
Practical. You can read all the literature, but what on earth are these people talking about?
Because you're describing something called a safety system, like how to soothe and keep ourselves safe
Yeah.
by recognizing and validate. But yeah, that's a really, how do you do that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you touched on that breathing. Absolutely learn how to breathe properly, which is a whole other thing. breathing is a really quick and simple way. The way we speak to ourselves, so going back to that inner critic, instead of being really harsh and punitive, the way we speak to ourselves can change almost instantly physiologically what's going on. So an example would be if you are walking along with a child and they trip and fall, graze their knee. How are you going to respond to that child? You're probably going to respond with concern, check that they're all right. Oh no, I'm glad you didn't get too hurt. Let's dust you off, have a hug. Are you all right? Let's carry on. But if you think about, and I'm not very coordinated, so I trip a lot. If you think about the way you speak to yourself, if you stumble or if you drop something or if you trip, I would put money on it. It's not that same tone. It's usually far more critical, even really nasty. I'd be, oh, you were such an idiot. I can't believe you did that again. Oh my gosh, people are watching you. Like, what are they going to think? What's that? That's going to put you straight back into that threat system. And it might seem at this point unrealistic to think, well, if we talk to ourselves more lovingly and kindly and compassionately, it's just out of reach for a lot of us
Well, your
because
brain's clever, isn't it?
it's
If
clever.
we go, oh, you silly duffer, the
Yeah.
brain's going to go and override, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
it knows what it's going to believe, and
Yeah.
so that's so far from what we feel about ourselves.
Yes. You say that, and I'm like, yes, that reminds me of conversations I've had with therapists who've been to therapists because it's like, no, I know what you're doing. I know what you're trying to convince me of, and I don't believe it for 1 second. I'm
Yeah,
smarter than that.
yeah,
Um, so adding in a neutral statement
okay.
can placate the brain, maybe. I'm not going to say like go around it because, like I said, our brain's smart, inner critic's smart. But if you add in the words, I can learn to, I am able to, I
Yeah,
can choose
yeah.
to those, it takes that all or nothing pressure off. So I can learn to be more patient with myself. I can learn to be more understanding. It takes the threat out of it because you can't fail, really.
And that's so beautiful because it gives capacity building, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I can learn this, even though I'm not there yet.
Yep.
I can, or I did just fail, but I'm okay. Or
Yep.
like, you know what I mean? Like that's like it's bringing that more neutral statement. You are okay. You're not
Yep.
injured. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
Versus that critical. So it's that neutral.
Yep.
And I guess we can take that to another level of self-compassion to our own selves, where we're critical of I see as our body image or our body parts, or
Yep.
dislike that neutral statement rather than I love my body. If we're
Yep.
not there, even in that sense,
Yes.
can we go maybe a neutral statement there that my legs are functional, or they allow me
Yeah.
to move, or they help
Yep.
me walk from the car to the kid drop off this
Yep.
morning.
Yep.
And that can help maybe build this thing of self compassion, which you said is important so that we're not burning out. Like if we
Yeah.
keep using that threat system of inner critic system, we're burning ourselves
Yep.
out. Where if we can add a layer of this, like learn self compassion, even in a neutral statement
Yep.
of
Yeah.
those sort of things, that's actually, like you said, bringing us out of that threat system, which uses up extra energy, which
Mm-hmm.
exhausts our body because it
Mm-hmm.
feels like we've got to run 24/7.
Yep.
That breathing you mentioned was so important. And when you're running, you're fast breathing. When you're resting, you're deep breathing. So it's
Yeah.
communicating with our body's stress responses. Um,
Yeah.
and that helps us have capacity to do the day rather than using up our day so quickly because of we're living in that threat system, even in the way we're thinking about ourselves or our actions or when we tripped over or those sorts of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, you and I could talk threat system all day. Um,
Mm,
because it's what we see, right? It is. And
mm,
the opposite of being in that threat system is being in that regulated, soothed system. And that is where we heal, we repair, we grow, we have time to ponder and reflect on our lives or things that we want to change. We have time and space to plan, to
mm.
engage with people and connect. We don't do those things in a threat response. We can't. That's not the point of it.
Yeah. So if we want to not burn out,
Yep.
enable our health, um, we all need to learn more self-compassion. Like it's not a
Yeah.
buzzword. It's not something
No.
we're born with, but it's something imperative to our long-term survival, really,
Yeah.
in terms of learning this new safety system for us,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So our two takeaways are um, breathing, diaphragmic breathing, which
Yep.
is yeah, there's lots on that, but even at
Yep.
the car lights, like in the car, at the traffic lights, or wherever
Yep.
we can learn to breathe. And we see that little kids, they breathe beautifully when they're sleeping, they're breathing. Um, and then if we notice that critical thinking that we talked about last time, that inner critic, to recognize, validate, but then even adding, if we can't do that, self-compassion, particularly that I can learn to, those neutral
Yep.
statements about that position allows us to come out of that negative system or that
Yep.
threat system, sorry,
Yep.
which builds our capacity. And I've learned self-compassion is endless. We have endless amount of self-compassion to give to others. We just need to learn the permission to give it to ourselves. And the more we give to
Yeah.
ourselves, the more we can actually give to others because we're not as burnt out by the end
Yeah.
of the day or the end of the week or the end of the month.
And I think this is where finding, I know we probably say it every time, but finding professional, finding someone that
Mm.
you
Yeah.
feel safe with to explore this, because it's hard to learn. It is a really hard skill. And
Mm.
especially if you're in, like your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, that's a long time to learn one way of being. And then to just expect yourself to flip it on your own without assistance.
Yeah.
We all need to invest in ourselves, and sometimes that is having someone else to
Mm.
help us unravel that.
Learn that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our disclaimer that we again forgot was this is not medical advice. We are just having that discussion. But yeah, absolutely
Yeah.
please seek professional help. And I guess today we're just opening up a conversation
Yeah.
in that it's not like for me learning that I'm not odd that I don't know how to do this. This
Yeah.
is actually something we all collectively is another pillar of health to look
Yeah.
after ourselves. And
Absolutely.
it's not just, go and have a nice facial. It actually has really important roots
Yeah.
to our long-term health to help, yeah, the inner critic and that threat system and all those pillars that
Yeah.
add to our health. You're an absolute gem, Sarah. I love
Thank
these
you.
chats.
I know. I was like,
Um,
oh, we
yeah,
can never stick to time. That's the problem. We'll get there.
I know. We'll
We'll just
get
do more.
there. We'll learn that skill.
I can learn to know when to stop talking. Yeah, there you go. Compassion.
Yeah,
Love it.
it's a journey.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for your time, Sarah. And
Thank you.
those who, Sarah is Songbird, a principal psychologist at Songbird Psychology, and myself, a women's health dietitian in Maitland. So thank you for your time, guys. If you have topics that you would like us to cover, please DM us. We would love to hear from you. Or if any feedback on these, we are would love to hear your feedback as well because
Yeah,
we are just doing these guys together as a group of women learning life
yeah.
really together.
self-compassion. We can learn. We can learn too.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Sarah.
All right. See ya. Bye.